Back in his college coaching days, former Seattle Seahawks head coach Pete Carroll called all of his players out to the football field after midnight to play games of tug of war against each other. He had borrowed a very large rope from a local fire station and had all the players line up on either side of it and compete offense versus defense, cornerbacks versus receivers, uh, different groups among the team, and had them compete to see who could pull the other guys down. And after a few rounds of that, he explained to him that the problem with this is that anytime you're pulling against people you should be working with, you're never all going to win together. You have to be pulling on the same side to actually be able to win as a team. And he had these signs hung up in the Seahawks training center that said, "I'm in," during his tenure there. And what those signs meant was, I'm in, pulling on the same side with the rest of the guys. I'm in to be a part of the team. And so it was a symbol of that. Nowadays, we see a very good example of the opposite of that, and about what happens when that belief isn't understood or followed in politics today. The two political parties that control the political scene in the US, the Democrats and the Republicans, have shown exactly what happens when instead of pulling together, you pull against each other. George Washington, in his 1796 farewell address from office, made a point of saying how much he did not believe that political parties would be in the best interest of the country and that we should not allow them to become a part of our political system because of the danger they pose to our government and its function, and the good of the people. So we see that now more than ever because it has become such a deeply divided government. We see the battles that take place on that, the polarization they call it, where the two large political parties that have no rivals at this point are constantly fighting against each other instead of focusing on operating government functioning and really accomplishing a lot. Uh, this is a very big issue because we see this in how legislation is passed, what legislation gets passed, and how slowly it happens. The bartering, the bickering, and the blocking that happens in attempts to get any kind of effective and modern legislation to go through. We see this in how much money is spent on political elections, specifically the presidential election, and how that creates barriers to anybody else being able to even compete in office, and how it really pushes aside a lot of other important aspects to who can be president and who can even hold any office in this country, because of the capital required to run for office now. We see this even in what was supposed to be a neutral, independent branch of our national government, the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land that holds power over, the legal system in this country and makes these landmark decisions that affect the nation. We see how the political parties have turned that into just another battleground for them and compete and fight against each other. So, this shift has really been seen from government focusing on bettering the nation, serving its citizens, and, making this a great country to fighting for power between themselves and focusing on beating each other rather than on doing their jobs, finding solutions, solving problems, and cooperating. And, the swift and effective passage of legislation has been crippled by the two-party system and the competition that the two parties have between each other. In 2023, the Senate held 700 votes, and of those 700 votes, they got 27 bills signed into law by the president. Works out to about 3.9% of votes, resulting in a law being signed into effect. That's how effective our government is today with a divided or with a Senate controlled by the Republican Party and a Democratic president sitting in office. And this is pretty accurate to any two groups of government right now that is divided between being controlled by Republicans and Democrats, and how much they can get done together with cooperation. They call it bipartisan cooperation, and it is a very rare thing. More commonly now is polarization, which is the lack of cooperation between the two. Quite literally, a gap between the two, a stark contrast. And they're very clear on their position. When one group controls one branch and another controls another, their job is not to find a common ground and cooperate. It is to be a stark opponent to them and fight to block them and prevent them from doing anything. That's what they've gotten to. This is most easily seen in filibusters in the Senate. Filibuster is a senator's right to unlimited debate, and that may sound a little unusual. The purpose of it is to allow them to, speak and advocate for whatever they believe in for as long as they feel necessary. Now it has turned into a method of blocking and stopping a bill from actually going to a vote. They debate for so long that it closes. They're not able to get anything. It's a stall tactic that is used by the Senate. And to end a filibuster, which is their debate as they continue on for an unlimited amount of time, it requires a vote on cloture. Between 2001 to 2010, there were 367 votes cloture to end a filibuster. Then from 2011 to 2020, there was 1,035 votes on cloture. The amount of votes right there shows how many more filibusters occurred and how much deeper that divide had gotten between the two parties, how much farther they'd taken the fighting, the bickering, the blocking, by how many more votes for cloture were required. It almost tripled between those decades, and it shows in their effectiveness. What did they accomplish during that time? Instead of actually working on passing legislation, they were working blocking legislation. And that lack of action is very clearly felt by the citizens of this country. The Pew Research Center did a 2023 survey, and they asked citizens how they felt about government. 8 out of 10 US citizens answered negatively about government when asked. And that really says a lot about what effect this divide between the two parties is having. As the world advances, the country advances, technology continues to get more advanced, and the economy changes, the labor market changes, and legislation is dragging so far behind that as the world changes, legislation isn't keeping up. They're too busy bickering, filibustering to get anything accomplished, and the citizens are feeling that directly. They feel that every day of their lives because that directly affects them and their livelihoods and how they survive. So, this is a big issue. And these problems aren't just when they're in office. This problem starts with the beginning of the process of taking office in the election. Every election now is a very, politically charged, money-driven event. It's no longer about what candidate is the most qualified for an office. What good can they do in office, but can they raise the funds? Can they get the support to take office? Because rather than putting the most qualified candidate into office, the two parties are concerned about winning the office. They don't particularly care who gets in the office, just that it's someone who is affiliated with and a member of their party. Donald Trump, when he ran originally in the 2016 presidential election, one of the reasons that he was able to come out on top of that very large Republican pool of candidates was because people kept talking about that he would be able to self-fund, how much money he was going to be able to put in his presidential fund because he was a billionaire. He was so rich, he had his own money. And that meant that he was not going to be taking money from these donors, these large corporations who were going to be expecting favors in return. Now, that isn't how it actually worked out, but that was a big plus from him originally, as he had that money and that wealth. A lot of people didn't talk about how intelligent he was, how qualified he was, how knowledgeable he was, or his experience in the political world, which at that time he had very little, almost none, uh, almost no involvement, never held elected office, but he had a lot of money. And that's a big factor when going and running, because if you have money, it's easier to raise money. People know that that is such a large factor in elections nowadays that they weigh that more heavily than qualifications. And the 2020 presidential election showed that very clearly. That election uh, showed that there was over $14 billion spent on the election. That was twice what was spent on the previous election, 2016 presidential election. Uh, you think about what it takes to get $14 billion, and if you divide that roughly in half there, and you say that each candidate spent about seven, how many people can raise $7 billion in this country? How many smaller parties? They do exist out there, the Green Party, Libertarian Party, so on, that are out there. How many of those can raise $7 billion in hopes of putting their candidate into the office of president? Uh, Not very many. There's only so much money out there. There's only so many people donating, and the people donating do expect something in return for that investment, because to them, that's what it is. It is an investment. It is not a donation, but it is money given in expectation of getting something back. What they get back, they expect favors. They expect uh, legislation that benefits them, and so many different things. And it can be seen in a variety of ways of what is possible by elected officials, the president, senators, congressmen, what they're able to do and the influence they have in office, that they can return those favors, those donations, with. And a good example of that would be Robert F. Kennedy in the most recent 2024 presidential election. He ran as an independent, and before that was most closely associated with Democratic Party. Um, After advice from his campaign and looking at the numbers, he sat down and had a conversation with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris at separate times. And Donald Trump had made him an offer for, should Donald Trump win the office of president, that he would put him in a position in his cabinet. So Kennedy came out in support of Donald Trump for president and said to all of his supporters that they should go vote for Donald Trump and they should be supporting Donald Trump because, of course, he would get a position in Donald Trump's presidential cabinet. And Kamala Harris didn't offer them that, despite Kennedy, coming from a background more closely associated with Democrats, despite coming from a family very, historic legacy of Democrats, the Kennedys, one of the closest families to royalty we have in America. Uh, he supported the Republican candidate. And why did he do that? Did he support him just because he believed he was the best, or because there was something in it for him? That's really what it comes down to when it comes to elections, is people support those they think will get them something in return, or that they know will return to them whatever they gave them with it interest. So, these barriers to being able to run, the money required to do it, the influence required to do it, really keeps the political landscape as a two-horse race between the Republicans and the Democrats. And, it is seen in their battles for Congress, the presidency, and very clearly nowadays in the Supreme Court. While the Supreme Court was supposed to be a neutral third branch of the federal government, it has become the center of one of the largest political battles between Democrats and Republicans today. The passing of Associate Justice Scalia during the final year of Obama's last year in presidency, the majority Republican Senate refused to allow Obama's nomination for Supreme Court justice to replace Justice Scalia. and he had over 8 months left on the term. The Republican Senate announced that that appointment was to be made by the president coming into office, and it would be a representation of the people's will of who got that seat on the Supreme Court bench. And that is such a big deal nowadays because those are not an appointment that holds a term limit. It is not an appointment made for a certain amount of years. It is an appointment made till retirement or death, more commonly death. There is currently one um, sitting member of the Supreme Court who has been on there for over 30 years. So you think presidents are for 4 years, uh, and then you have a term limit of two, so maximum of 8 years. So in that time, you could have 4 or 5 presidents as somebody who's been on the Supreme Court. And they would not allow Obama, a Democrat, to have that nominee of his go onto the bench, despite the adamant refusal that any member of the Supreme Court is politically affiliated with one of the two major parties. They do have a bias that leans either conservative or Democratic. And, after Donald Trump won that 2016 presidential election and took office, the Republican Senate and him seated conservative Justice Gorsuch, despite a filibuster by the Democrats over that because of their um, opposition. Obviously, they felt that it was improper that they refused to allow President Obama to seat a justice and nominate a justice, and then just gave it to Trump after he came into office. That was a landmark there, the filibuster, because it changed the Republican majority changed the requirement for confirming a Supreme Court justice from what is called a supermajority, requiring 60% of the vote, to a simple majority, requiring 50% of a vote, 50% of the votes, or more. And that really is another indication of how deeply divided Congress has gotten because they no longer can rely on that supermajority between themselves to settle a vote. It just isn't possible with the divide because if you don't have 60 seats in the Senate for one party, then a vote will never be passed. And many times it is not. Most of the recent Supreme Court confirmation votes have not hit 60. They've been 53, 54 in favor, and then 46, 47 against. Um, then came the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the final year of the Trump presidency. And at that time, Trump had about 4 months left on his term, despite refusing to allow Obama to nominate, much less confirm a appointee for the Supreme Court when he had 8 months left to go. With 4 months left to go, the Republican majority Senate and Donald Trump nominated and seated Justice Barrett into the Supreme Court. The Democrats boycotted the Senate judiciary vote for her nomination before she was confirmed, um, but they did not have the majority, so they were not. It was a protest, not in effect, but to send a message. It did not change the outcome in any way, but it was their protest against the unfairness, the hypocritical nature of allowing that appointment to be made despite the adamant refusal from the Republican Congress or the Republican Senate uh, during Obama's presidency, refusing to allow him, his nominee at that time. And, it really shows that that independent branch of government that holds so much power has been influenced heavily by politics and the political parties. And the danger that they pose to this country that George Washington was afraid of is starting to come to light, and it's starting to be seen very clearly in these different branches of government. You can see this now in what was supposed to be an independent branch of the three branches of national government. So that's a very scary thought to have, um, of how much influence it has over those lifetime appointments, and how far they're willing to go to get somebody aligned with their party into those spots. Legislation in the US is not nearly as effective as it once was, a shadow of its former self. They are far less interested in serving the people and bettering the nation, advancing the country, supporting the economy, and improving upon, all this country stands for. And they're more focused on taking control, being in power, taking spots in office, having the majorities, having the most critical offices, whether it be the Senate, the House, Supreme Court, presidency, obviously. That's their focus now. And it's really moved away from the focus of the people. They talk about, who they support, who their constituents are, but they lose sight of that even in their quest to take office, and then especially when they get into office nowadays. Their focus becomes the other party and not helping people, not bettering the country. Their failures can be seen in the struggles of the education system, and the failures of the criminal justice system, uh, and in every underserved community in this country that would really benefit from the national government focusing on what they can do to, continue these legacies and these programs and continue to advance them beyond what they were and are now. These battles for control are very expensive, and the people paying the price for it are not the Democrats or the Republicans, it's the citizens. To say the two-party system doesn't work isn't true, because it does work. It works for the politicians, it works for the Fortune 500 companies who support them, for those with political influence and those at the top who are either in control or soon to take control from the other. It works for them, but it doesn't work for the people relying on social services, the people who are struggling with healthcare, the people who are struggling to make ends meet and who are being failed by our government on a large scale uh, at the national level. For those people, it doesn't work. It works for the people who are fighting for the power and fighting for control. Pete Carroll, he held games of tug of war after midnight with his players to try and show them what happens, and how it's impossible to win together if you're pulling against each other. And I'm really hoping this speech was a good way of showing people, those of you listening, that, that's what's happening today. We're seeing now today that exact same thing in politics. There may not be a rope, but it's definitely two groups pulling against each other. And soon we're going to see what happens when they finally break that rope, and the result of that. Thank you.